June 2003, Oakhaven Valley. The air was thick with the scent of cut hay and the coming heat of a long summer. It was a place defined by its rhythms, by the slow turning of the seasons that dictated the work of every man and woman who lived within the valley's protective embrace. For generations, the families of Oakhaven had farmed this land, their fortunes tied to the richness of the soil and the predictability of the rain. In recent decades, that fortune had become increasingly tied to the turkey. Alara Vance lived on 100 acres of rolling pasture and mixed woodland that her grandfather had cleared with mules and dynamite. At 72, she moved with the slow, deliberate economy of someone who had never wasted emotion in her life. Her hands, gnarled by work and weather, were as familiar with the heft of a post-hole digger as they were with the delicate task of mending a fence. She lived alone in the same small farmhouse her father had built, a structure of white clapboard and green trim that had settled into the landscape as naturally as the ancient oaks that gave the valley its name. The valley had changed. Where once a dozen small, diversified farms had raised cattle, corn, and tobacco, there were now 12 large-scale operations dedicated solely to poultry. Long, low-slung metal buildings, gleaming under the sun, dotted the landscape. They housed thousands of broad-breasted white turkeys, a breed engineered for maximum meat production in the minimum amount of time. The economics were simple and brutal. The contracts were with large corporations, the feed was delivered in bulk, and the profit margins were thin as a whisper. It was a system that valued efficiency above all else. Alara Vance did not participate in this system. Her farm was a relic, a living museum of a bygone era. She kept a small herd of Hereford cattle, a large vegetable garden, and a flock of 40 turkeys. Her turkeys were not the uniform, sterile white of her neighbors. They were a motley collection of bronze, Narragansett, and bourbon red heritage breeds that looked as if they had stepped out of a 19th century painting. They were loud, curious, and athletic birds, spending their days foraging across a 10-acre pasture she rotated religiously. To the other farmers in Oakhaven Valley, Alara's flock was a curiosity, a hobby. They called them her pets or her lawn ornaments. The trouble started as a rumor, carried on the wind like a stray seed. It came from counties to the east, whispered over crackling phone lines, and discussed in low tones at the feed store. A new strain of avian influenza, they said, highly contagious and devastatingly lethal. It moved faster than any disease the state veterinarians had seen before. At first, it was a distant problem, something happening to other people in other places. But the whispers grew louder, more urgent. It had jumped the river. It was in the next county. The problem, as it was understood by the men who gathered for coffee at the Oakhaven Feed and Seed, was one of biosecurity. Modern poultry farming was a fortress. The birds lived their entire lives indoors, on clean bedding, breathing filtered air. Their feed was scientifically formulated, their water treated. Workers showered and changed into sanitized coveralls before entering the barns. On paper, it was an impenetrable system, but the disease did not respect paper. It found its way in. The history of turkey farming in the valley was a story of consolidation. Alara remembered a time when nearly every farm had a small flock of turkeys roaming the barnyard. They were hardy birds that ate insects and scraps, roost in trees, and required little attention. They were a Thanksgiving tradition and a small but reliable source of income. Then came the rise of the commercial breeds in the 1960s. The broad-breasted white could grow to market weight in 16 weeks, nearly twice as fast as the old breeds. Its breast meat was unnaturally large, catering to consumer demand. But the bird had paid a steep price for this efficiency. It could no longer fly, it could barely walk, and it could not reproduce naturally. Every commercial turkey in the world was the product of artificial insemination. The old breeds had faded away, deemed inefficient and unprofitable. The knowledge of how to raise them faded as well. By the turn of the century, Alara Vance was the only person in Oakhaven Valley, and perhaps the entire county, who still kept a breeding population of heritage turkeys. She had been offered contracts by the big poultry companies many times over the years. They saw her 100 acres of prime pasture land as the perfect spot for 4 new state-of-the-art turkey barns. Each time, she had politely declined. Her refusal was a source of quiet amusement and frustration for her neighbors, who saw her as a stubborn old woman sitting on a gold mine. They did not understand that for Alara, the land was not a mine to be exploited, but a trust to be maintained. The crisis arrived not with a bang, but with a notice tacked to the bulletin board at the post office. The county extension office was holding an emergency meeting for all poultry producers. Attendance was mandatory. The disease was no longer a rumor. It had a name, a designation from the Department of Agriculture, and it was now confirmed in 3 neighboring counties. The valley was on high alert. The fortress was about to be besieged. The foil to Alara's quiet wisdom arrived in a new county-issued Ford Ranger. His name was Ben Carter. He was 28 years old, with a fresh master's degree in poultry science from the State University and a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He was a man of data, of spreadsheets, and of peer-reviewed studies. He saw farming not as a way of life, but as a complex biological system to be managed and optimized. He had been assigned to Oakhaven Valley 6 months prior, and he was eager to implement the latest protocols and prove his worth. The meeting was held in the high school gymnasium. The air was tense. The faces of the farmers were grim. These were men with immense debt, their livelihoods dependent on the health of the fragile birds housed in their metal barns. They sat on the wooden bleachers, their caps in their hands, listening as Ben Carter stood at a podium, a PowerPoint presentation projected on the wall behind him. Carter was a polished speaker. He used terms like biosecurity vectors, pathogen load, and flock depopulation protocols. He presented charts showing the exponential spread of the virus. His message was clear. The only defense was a militant adherence to a strict set of rules. He outlined the new requirements: mandatory foot baths with Virkin S disinfectant at the entrance to every farm, detailed visitor logs, and a complete cessation of all non-essential traffic. He recommended that farmers keep a dedicated set of clothes and boots for each barn, to be worn only inside and never taken home. The modern commercial turkey, Carter explained, his voice echoing slightly in the large room, is a marvel of genetic engineering. But that specialization comes with a trade-off. Their immune systems are, to be frank, not robust. They have been raised in sterile environments, shielded from the pathogens that their ancestors faced. This makes them highly susceptible. Our biosecurity is their only immune system. He clicked to a new slide, a picture of a pristine, modern turkey barn. This is our strength, a controlled environment. We control the air, the water, the feed. We can, and we must control the introduction of any and all pathogens. Your entire operation, your entire livelihood, depends on maintaining the integrity of this barrier. When he finished, he asked for questions. A few farmers asked about the availability of disinfectant, about the procedures for reporting sick birds. The mood was somber, fearful. Then, from the back of the bleachers, a voice, quiet but clear, spoke up. What about the birds that live outside? All heads turned. Alara Vance stood, her small frame straight and unbowed. She rarely attended community meetings, and her presence was a surprise to many. Ben Carter squinted, trying to place her. He had seen her once, on a county survey drive, and had mentally filed her farm under non-commercial/hobbyist. "Ma'am," he asked, a note of impatience in his tone. "My turkeys are on pasture," Alara said simply. "They aren't in a barn. What should I do for them?" A few of the other farmers shifted uncomfortably. Some exchanged knowing glances. Carter gave a small, indulgent smile, the kind a teacher might give a child who has asked a naive question. "Well," he began, his tone condescendingly gentle, "for a small backyard flock, the risk is different. They're not part of the commercial system, so they don't pose the same kind of economic threat. Honestly, the best you can do is hope for the best. The heritage breeds, while not economically viable, are sometimes perceived as being hardier. But against a novel virus like this one, with this level of virulence, frankly, their chances are slim to none if it gets into the valley. There's no effective biosecurity for a free-range flock. They're exposed to everything. Wild birds, rodents, you name it. He gestured dismissively. My advice would be to enjoy them while you have them. But the focus of our efforts, the focus of the county and the state, has to be on protecting the commercial flocks. That's where the industry is. I'm sorry. He turned away, looking for the next, more serious question, the dismissal clear and absolute. Alara sat down. She did not look angry or embarrassed. She simply absorbed his words, her expression unreadable. She had not expected help, but the casual, pitying arrogance of his response settled in the air. She had asked a practical question and had been given a pat on the head. The next morning, at the Oakhaven Feed and Seed, the meeting was the only topic of conversation. The chorus of skeptics, a group of farmers who held court around the wood stove each morning, had already rendered their verdict. "Did you hear old Alara Vance?" said Silas Black, a man who ran a six-barn operation on the north side of the valley, asking Carter what to do about her pet chickens. "Turkeys," corrected Jed Miller, whose own farm was mortgaged to the hilt. "And they're not pets, they're lawn ornaments. Walk around like they own the place," he chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Carter put her in her place, though. "Enjoy them while you have them," that's a nice way of saying they're already dead. "She's a fool," Silas declared, sipping his coffee from a styrofoam cup. "Sitting on 100 acres of prime land, running a handful of useless birds. If she had 2 modern barns on that property, she'd be set for life. Instead, she's got a bunch of wild things that'll be buzzard food in a month." "It's a shame," another farmer chimed in. "Her father, Thomas, he was a sharp man. Knew his livestock. Don't know what happened with her. Stuck in the past." They nodded in agreement, their consensus solidifying into fact. Alara Vance was a relic. Her methods were obsolete. Her birds were doomed. It was not a question of if, but when. Their focus was on their own survival, on the new protocols, on the price of disinfectant, and the terrifying fragility of their investment. Alara and her 40 heritage turkeys were a footnote, a sad, sentimental story that was about to come to its inevitable conclusion. They pitied her. Alara did not hear their words, but she felt their meaning in the air, in the way people averted their eyes when she went to town. She was used to being an outsider in the valley's modern agricultural landscape. The pity and the condescension were not new. What was new was the sense of an approaching storm, a test that she knew was coming for them all. That evening, as the sun set behind the western ridge, casting long shadows across her pasture, Alara did not think about Ben Carter's spreadsheets or the talk at the feed store. She stood by the fence line, watching her flock. The toms were displaying, their magnificent bronze and iridescent feathers fanned out, their heads a patriotic display of red, white, and blue. The hens clucked contentedly, scratching at the soil for insects. They were not just lawn ornaments. They were a legacy. She closed her eyes and could almost feel her father standing beside her. Thomas Vance had been a man of few words, but his understanding of the land and its creatures ran deeper than the valley's own bedrock. He had passed this farm to her not as a piece of property, but as a living system, a complex web of relationships between soil, plant, and animal. And he had taught her the principles that governed it. The narrative of her life, the source of her quiet confidence, was rooted in the past, in memories as vivid as the evening sky. She remembered being a girl of 10, following her father as he walked the pastures. He wasn't just walking, he was reading the land, a text only he could understand. He would stop, crumble a piece of soil in his fingers, and say, "The clover's strong here. The birds will do well." He taught her the names of the grasses and the weeds: chicory, plantain, dandelion, nettle. To the other farmers, they were pests to be eradicated with herbicides. To her father, they were medicine. "Most folks see a weed and want to kill it," he had told her once, his voice a low rumble. "They want a clean field, a monoculture. But nature doesn't like things clean like that. A healthy pasture has a little bit of everything. The chicory helps with parasites. The plantain is good for their gut. The birds know what they need. You just have to give them the chance to find it." Her father was the mentor, the source of a knowledge that couldn't be learned in a university classroom. He had been a self-taught geneticist, a keen observer of his animals. He kept meticulous records, not on a computer, but in a series of leather-bound ledgers. After he died, Alara had preserved them as if they were holy texts. They were the physical manifestation of her family's wisdom. That night, she pulled one of the ledgers from the old oak secretary in the living room. The book was heavy, the leather cover worn smooth by her father's hands. The pages were filled with his neat, blocky script. The entries spanned decades. He didn't just record births and deaths. He recorded observations. April 12, 1958. Move the flock to the north pasture. Notice the hens are favoring the broadleaf plantain. Weather has been damp. They know it's good for them. The Tom from the Miller line is showing good leg strength. Will keep his sons for breeding. October 3rd, 1962. New poultryman from the university came by, talking about confinement. Says it's the future. Says my birds put on weight too slow. I told him they also put on strength. He didn't understand. He sees the bird, but he doesn't see the life in it. May 20th, 1971. A bout of blackhead went through the county. Lost half my neighbor's flock. My birds were exposed, but I lost only one old hen who was already weak. The flocks foraging on the Sericea, Lespedisia, seems to have helped. Their resistance is strong this year. Constant exposure to the little sicknesses of the world is like a whetstone for a knife. It keeps them sharp. As she read, she heard her father's voice articulating the core principle that guided his entire philosophy, a truth that was the complete antithesis of Ben Carter's presentation. He had said it to her many times, in many ways, but the clearest memory was of a day they stood watching a hawk circle overhead. Her father had pointed not at the fence meant to keep predators out, but at the turkeys themselves, who were alert and bunched together, their eyes on the sky. The strength isn't in the fence, Alara, he had said. The fence can always be broken. The strength is in the bird. It's in its bones, in its blood, in its mind. You can't build a strong bird in a sterile box. You build it out here in the real world. You let it face the wind and the rain. You let it learn to find its own food and watch for its own enemies. You breed for smarts and for strong legs, not just for a big chest. You build the strength inside them, and they'll take care of themselves. This was the hidden knowledge. It was not a secret formula, but a fundamentally different way of seeing the world. Ben Carter and the other farmers saw the turkey as a product, a delicate machine to be shielded from all risk in a controlled environment. Alara, taught by her father, saw the turkey as a living creature, whose health and resilience were a direct result of its engagement with a complex, challenging environment. Carter's system was designed to prevent exposure. Her father's system was designed to build resilience through exposure. The ledger was more than a record. It was a blueprint. It detailed her father's decades-long breeding program. He had carefully selected birds not just for their size, but for their foraging ability, their attentiveness as mothers, their natural resistance to disease. He traded toms with the few other old-timers in the state who kept heritage flocks, maintaining genetic diversity, always seeking to add vigor to his line. The 40 birds in her pasture were the result of this patient, multi-generational work. They were a living library of genetic strength. Closing the book, Alara felt a quiet resolve settle over her. She would not be enjoying her birds while she had them. She would be stewarding them through the coming storm, relying not on disinfectants and quarantines, but on the wisdom recorded in the ledger and the inherent strength of the birds themselves. Her work had already been done over the course of the last 50 years. Now, all she could do was trust it. The protagonist, armed with this profound, non-obvious knowledge, decided to act. Or rather, to continue acting as she always had. Her response to the impending crisis was not to change, but to double down on the methods her father had taught her. She did this quietly, without seeking approval or announcing her intentions. Her actions were her only statement. While her neighbors were stringing up warning signs and buying disinfectant in 55-gallon drums, Alara was walking her fence line. She wasn't looking for holes a person could get through. She was looking for the subtle signs of the pasture's health. She checked the growth of the clover, the spread of the chicory. She noted the number of grasshoppers, a key source of protein for her flock. Her biosecurity was not at the gate. It was in the soil, in the biodiversity of the sward. The unconventional tools she used were not machines, but the birds themselves and the landscape they inhabited. Her primary tool was rotational grazing. She used lightweight, portable electric netting, powered by a solar charger, to create paddocks within the larger pasture. Every few days, she moved the flock to fresh ground. This was a slow, methodical process that had multiple benefits. It prevented the buildup of parasites in the soil. It allowed the forage to recover and regrow. And it constantly provided the birds with a new environment to explore, keeping them active and engaged. Her equipment was old and well-maintained. A 1972 Ford tractor for mowing the pastures after the birds had grazed them down. A hand-cranked seed spreader for overseeding with clover and other beneficial herbs. Her mobile roosts were simple A-frame structures she had built herself from scrap lumber, easy to drag to a new paddock. They were open air, providing shelter from the rain, but allowing for constant airflow, preventing the buildup of ammonia and airborne pathogens that plagued the confinement barns. The process was a daily ritual, a conversation with the land. Each morning, she would walk among the flock, not just feeding them, but observing them. Her father had taught her what to look for: the brightness of an eye, the smoothness of the feathers, the color of the snood on a tom, the way a bird carried itself. She could spot a turkey that was feeling slightly off from 50 yards away. Her supplemental feed was not a high-protein commercial mix, but a simple ration of cracked corn and oats with a bit of kelp meal for minerals. It was meant to be just that, a supplement. The bulk of their diet came from the pasture: grasses, legumes, insects, and the wild herbs her father had valued so much. The disease arrived in Oakhaven Valley on a Tuesday in July. It hit Silas Black's farm first. One of his workers reported a few birds that seemed lethargic. Within 24 hours, dozens were dead. By the end of the week, the mortality rate in the first affected barn was over 90%. State veterinarians arrived in white hazmat suits, and the grim work of depopulation began. The entire flock of 10,000 birds was gassed with carbon dioxide, and their carcasses composted in massive, plastic-shrouded piles. A quarantine zone of 10 miles was established around the farm. Panic spread through the valley like fire in a dry field. The fortress had been breached. Despite all the protocols, all the disinfectants, the virus had found a way inside. Ben Carter was a whirlwind of frantic activity. He drove from farm to farm, his face pale and drawn, checking logs, inspecting foot baths, taking samples. He ordered even stricter measures: no one in or out. Farmers were to live like hermits, isolating themselves from their own families if necessary. The men at the feed store were no longer talking with bravado. Their conversations were hushed, fearful. They spoke of bank loans and ruin. 2 more farms went down in the second week, both well within the quarantine zone. The pattern was terrifyingly random. One farm would be hit, while the one right next to it would be spared for a few more days. It seemed to defy the logic of epidemiology. Through all this, Alara continued her quiet routine. Her farm was well within the quarantine zone, surrounded by infected properties. From her porch, she could see the strange, silent activity at her neighbors' farms. The official vehicles, the plumes of steam rising from the compost piles. It was a grim, surreal sight. The community, in its fear, watched her. They saw her out in the pasture every day, moving her fences, her flock of colorful birds foraging in the open air. Her actions seemed like madness, a flagrant disregard for the invisible enemy that was destroying them. The pity they had felt for her curdled into a kind of morbid fascination. She was a case study in foolishness, and they were all waiting for the inevitable outcome. Jed Miller, whose farm bordered Alara's to the east, saw her one afternoon from his truck. He had just come from a meeting with his banker, and the news was not good. He was one of the few who had not yet been hit, but the stress was wearing him down. He stopped his truck and watched as Alara calmly raked out one of her mobile roosts. Her turkeys, a vibrant splash of color against the green grass, seemed utterly unconcerned, chasing grasshoppers with an energy he hadn't seen in his own birds in years. To him, it looked like a pastoral scene from a forgotten time, beautiful but suicidally naive. He shook his head and drove on. The image of her healthy birds a strange and unsettling counterpoint to the ruin that was consuming his world. Ben Carter, making his rounds, drove past her lane. He saw the flock spread out across the hillside and felt a spike of anger and frustration. He had a degree, the backing of the state, the best scientific information available, and he was failing. The disease was outmaneuvering him at every turn. And here was this old woman, ignoring every single one of his protocols, her birds wandering around in the open air as if inviting infection. It was an insult to his expertise. He was tempted to drive up her lane and order her to lock the birds up, but he knew he had no authority. They were not part of the commercial program. So he just drove on, dismissing her as a lost cause, a variable he could not control and therefore had to ignore. Her inevitable failure would simply be another data point in the tragedy. The third week of July was the worst. The heat was oppressive, and the disease seemed to thrive in it. For more farms, including Jed Miller's, reported outbreaks. The valley fell into a stunned, eerie silence, broken only by the rumble of the rendering trucks and the low hum of the generators powering the fans in the few remaining uninfected barns. The economic heart of the community had stopped beating. Of the 12 commercial turkey farms in Oakhaven Valley, 9 were now empty, their owners facing financial devastation. And on a Vance farm, nothing happened. The 40 heritage turkeys continued to thrive. The first sign of success was not an event, but the absence of one. Day after day, Alara would walk out to her flock, a knot of apprehension in her stomach, and day after day, she would find them healthy. She watched for the slightest sign of trouble, a cough, a wheeze, a drooping wing. But there was nothing. Her birds remained active, their appetites robust, their eyes bright and clear. The toms continued their strutting displays, and the hens began to lay their clutches of speckled eggs in the nest they scratched out under the shade of the portable roosts. The contrast between her farm and the rest of the valley became starker with each passing day. The air over her neighbors' properties was still and lifeless. The long metal barns, which had once hummed with the sound of fans and the murmur of thousands of birds, were silent. The feed bins were empty. The driveways were barren, save for the tire tracks of official vehicles. Her own pasture, however, was a scene of constant, vibrant life. The calls of the turkeys, the chirping of crickets, the low buzz of bees in the clover. It was a pocket of normalcy in a world that had come undone. Ben Carter's reevaluation did not happen in a single moment of epiphany. It was a slow, creeping realization, born of exhaustion and failure. He had thrown every tool in his modern arsenal at the problem, and every tool had broken. The virus had defied quarantine lines, disinfectants, and every biosecurity protocol he had implemented. His confidence was shattered, replaced by a hollow sense of powerlessness. One evening, after another grueling day overseeing the disposal of Jed Miller's flock, he found himself driving aimlessly. He was supposed to go back to his small apartment, write up his daily report for the state, and try to get a few hours of sleep before doing it all again. Instead, he took a turn onto the Old Ridge Road, the one that offered a panoramic view of the valley. He parked his truck, got out, and leaned against the hood, the metal still warm from the engine. He looked down on the valley of his failure. He could see the silent, tomb-like barns of Silas Black, Jed Miller, and the others. He saw the massive compost piles, dark scars on the green landscape. His meticulously crafted plan to save the valley's poultry industry had ended in this ruin. Then his eyes drifted to a patch of land in the center of it all, a mosaic of green pasture and dark woods that looked different from the rest. It was the Vance farm, and there, in the fading light of dusk, he saw them, a small, mobile flock of birds moving slowly across the grass. They were not just alive, they were behaving like normal, healthy animals. He watched as a tom fanned its tail, a timeless display of vigor. He saw others dust-bathing in a patch of dry soil. He stood there for a long time, the engine of his truck ticking as it cooled. The sight of those 40 birds, thriving in the epicenter of a biological firestorm, was an irrefutable fact that stood in direct opposition to everything he knew, everything he had been taught. His entire framework of understanding began to crack. He had dismissed her as a sentimental hobbyist, her methods as unscientific, her flock as doomed. He had pitted her, but as he stood on that ridge, looking down at the single, solitary success in a valley of catastrophic failure, he knew with a sickening certainty that he had been the fool. The pity had been entirely misplaced. The final 2 commercial farms fell within the next week. The virus had been ruthlessly efficient. The success of Alara's method was now absolute, undeniable, and quantifiable. The numbers told the story with a brutal clarity that no anecdote could match. Total commercial turkeys in Oak Haven Valley at the beginning of July, approximately 65,000. Total commercial turkeys at the end of July, 0. The financial loss was estimated at over $2 million, not including the cost of cleanup and the long-term debt the farmers now faced. 12 families, pillars of the community, had lost their livelihoods. Ben Carter spreadsheets were now filled with zeros and negative numbers. In the data from the Vance farm, total heritage turkeys at the beginning of July, 40. Total heritage turkeys at the end of July, 40. Mortality rate, 0%. Economic impact, negligible because her small operation was self-sustaining and debt-free. But in the context of the valley, her success was immeasurable. She was the last one standing. The quarantine was eventually lifted. The state declared the Oak Haven outbreak contained, a word that sounded obscene in the face of the total devastation. The silence that settled over the valley was one of grief and shock. The rhythms of life had been broken. There were no more feed trucks rumbling down the roads, no more crews arriving to load out birds for the processing plant. There was only the quiet and the debt. For a week, Ben Carter did not leave his office. He answered calls from state officials and filled out paperwork. He avoided driving through the valley. The sight of the empty barns was a physical manifestation of his failure. But the image of Alara Vance's turkeys, healthy and vibrant on their pasture, was burned into his mind. It was a puzzle he had to solve, a piece of data that invalidated his entire model. He knew he couldn't just write it off as a fluke. It wasn't an anomaly. It was the only result that mattered. Finally, he knew what he had to do. He had to swallow his pride, a bitter meal for a young man who had so recently been brimming with it. He had to go and ask for help. He had to admit he was wrong. The foil returned. One bright, cool morning in early August, Ben Carter's Ford Ranger turned down Alara Vance's long, gravel driveway. He drove slowly, as if hesitant. The lane was lined with old maple trees, their leaves just beginning to hint at the coming autumn. He parked next to the small, tidy barn and got out. He was not the same man who had stood at the podium in the school gymnasium. His shoulders were slumped, his face was etched with fatigue, and the crisp confidence was gone, replaced by a profound and humbling uncertainty. Alara was near the garden, weeding a row of late beans. She saw the truck and stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. She watched him approach, her expression calm, betraying no surprise. She simply waited. He stopped a few feet from her, holding his university-logoed baseball cap in his hands, twisting the brim. He looked at the ground, then at her, then back at the ground. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his voice quiet, almost hoarse. I came to say I was wrong." The acknowledgement, the admission of error, hung in the air between them. It was a simple sentence, but it carried the weight of all the empty barns, all the ruined farms, all the failed protocols. "I was wrong," he repeated, as if needing to say it again to make it real. "Everything I told those farmers, everything I believed about how to handle this, it was all wrong. And you were right. I don't understand how, but you were. I came here to ask if you would be willing to teach me why." Alara looked at him for a long moment. There was no triumph in her eyes, no hint of "I told you so." There was only a quiet gravity. She had seen pride like his before. She had seen it broken before. She gave a small, slow nod. "The why is in the work," she said, her voice plain and direct. "Come, I will show you." The protagonist then explained. But she did not do it with a lecture or a presentation. She did it the way her father had taught her, by showing. There was no gloating, no recrimination. The lesson was not about his failure, but about the principles of a system he had never been trained to see. She led him first not to the turkeys, but to the pasture. She knelt down and pointed to the ground. "It starts here," she said. In the soil, she showed him the rich, dark earth, teeming with life. She explained how the rotational grazing of the turkeys, followed by the cattle, created a virtuous cycle. The animals fertilized the ground, and the diverse forage that grew from it, in turn, nourished the animals. She walked him through the paddock, pointing out the different plants. "This is broadleaf plantain," she said, touching a low-growing weed with wide, ribbed leaves. "It's a natural anti-inflammatory, good for the respiratory system. The birds will seek it out if they feel a tickle in their throat." She moved on. "This is chicory. See the little blue flowers? The roots are a natural dewormer. And this," she said, pointing to a patch of tough-looking grass, "is fescue. The commercial birds can't digest it well, but my birds have stronger gizzards. It scrubs their insides clean." Ben Carter listened, silent and intent. He was a scientist. He knew the Latin names of these plants, but he knew them only as weeds, as components of a pasture to be analyzed for their protein and fiber content. He had never considered their medicinal properties, nor the idea that an animal could self-medicate. Next, she led him to the flock. The birds, curious, gathered around them. They were not skittish or aggressive. They were calm and alert. "Look at them," Ilaris said. "They're not all the same. That big Tom, he's a standard bronze. See the way he stands? Strong, straight legs. That was something my father bred for. The commercial birds are so top-heavy, they can barely stand. A bird that can't move, well, can't forage. A bird that can't forage can't stay healthy." She pointed to a hen with a distinctive pattern of black and white. "That's a Narragansett. They're excellent mothers and the best foragers of all. They'll wander farther than the others, find things the rest of the flock misses. Genetic diversity isn't just a concept, Mr. Carter. It's a toolbox. Each breed has its own strengths. When you mix them, the whole flock is stronger." Finally, she took him back to the farmhouse. She retrieved one of her father's ledgers from the oak secretary and placed it on the kitchen table. She opened it to a page from 1971, the one detailing the blackhead outbreak. "My father wrote this," she said. "He was the real scientist. He didn't have a degree, but he had 50 years of observation. He watched, he paid attention, and he wrote it all down." Ben sat at the table and slowly, carefully turned the pages. He saw the decades of meticulous notes, the hand-drawn pedigrees, the observations on weather, forage, and animal health. It was a data set more profound and practical than any he had ever compiled on his computer. It was a record of a partnership with nature, not an attempt to conquer it. He believed the stress of a sterile, controlled environment was its own kind of sickness, Ilaris said, her voice soft. He said it made the birds weak in spirit, and a weak spirit leads to a weak body. He believed a little bit of challenge was a good thing. It kept them sharp. It taught their immune systems how to fight. She paused, looking out the window towards the pasture. "Your system was based on keeping the sickness out. My father's system was based on building the strength within. The fence, he always said, wasn't the most important thing. The bird was." Ben Carter finally looked up from the ledger, his eyes wide with the force of a paradigm shift. He had spent years learning how to build a better fence. It had never occurred to him that the real answer was to build a better bird. The knowledge was adopted. The change began slowly, not with a press conference, but with a report. Ben Carter returned to his office and began to write. He scrapped the official, formulaic incident report he was supposed to file. Instead, he wrote a detailed case study of the Oakhaven Valley outbreak. He contrasted the catastrophic failure of the 12 commercial farms with the complete success of what he termed the Vance Heritage flock. He used his scientific training to analyze and articulate the principles Ilera had shown him. He wrote about the importance of genetic diversity, the role of medicinal herbs in pasture-based systems, and the immunological benefits of a challenging, non-sterile environment. He included photographs of Alara's pasture and photocopies of pages from her father's ledgers. He titled the report, A Case for Resilience, Lessons from a Closed System Failure and an Open System Success. He sent the report to his superiors at the State Department of Agriculture. At first, it was met with skepticism. It ran counter to decades of established industry practice. But the data from Oakhaven was undeniable. The total wipeout of the commercial flocks was a disaster they could not ignore. His report, and the stark truth it contained, began to circulate. It was discussed in meetings, forwarded in emails. A few researchers at the university's agricultural school expressed interest. They wanted to study the Vance flock's genetics. Ben Carter's own work changed. He stopped being a promoter of the industrial model and became an advocate for sustainable, diversified farming. He started a small, experimental program through the Extension Office to help farmers interested in raising heritage breeds. He used Alara's farm, with her quiet permission, as his primary example. He was no longer a man with all the answers, but a man who knew how to ask the right questions and, more importantly, who to ask them of. The enduring symbol of the story, the object that represented the timelessness of the knowledge, was not a turkey, but the old leather-bound ledger. After his visit, Ben Carter had asked if he could borrow it. Alara, after a moment's thought, had agreed. He treated it with the reverence of a scholar handling a priceless manuscript. He scanned every page, creating a digital archive of Thomas Vance's life's work. The original ledger sat on his desk, a constant, tangible reminder of a different kind of wisdom. Its worn cover, its brittle, ink-filled pages, its faint smell of wood smoke and time. It was an artifact from a world where knowledge was earned through patience and observation, not downloaded from a server. It represented a truth that did not change with market trends or technological fads. It was a symbol of a deep, site-specific understanding that had proven more durable and more effective than all the accumulated hubris of the modern world. A new normal, a new stasis, slowly settled over Oakhaven Valley. The change was not dramatic or swift. Most of the empty turkey barns remained empty, monuments to a failed system. Some farmers sold their land and moved away. Others struggled to find a new way forward. But the talk of the feed store had changed. No one called Alara Vance's turkeys lawn ornaments anymore. They were now referred to, with a new and profound respect, as the Vance birds. The story of how her small, old-fashioned flock had survived when all others had perished became a piece of local lore. It was told and retold, a modern parable. The narrative shifted. Her stubbornness was reframed as wisdom. Her adherence to old ways was now seen as foresight. She was no longer a relic of the past, but a quiet prophet who had been right all along. Her success was no longer a remarkable anomaly. It had become an accepted, respected fact as solid and real as the oak trees that dotted her pastures. The knowledge was explicitly passed down. The torch found a new hand to carry it. One afternoon in the spring, a pickup truck, older than Ben Carter's but newer than Alara's, came down her lane. A young couple got out. It was the Millers, Jed's son and his wife. They had worked on Jed's farm, had lost everything alongside him. They were in their late 20s, with the tired eyes of people who had seen their future evaporate. Mrs. Vance, the young man, whose name was David, said, We want to start over, but not like before. We want to do it right. His wife, Sarah, spoke next. Mr. Carter told us about your father's journals. He said you have the strongest birds in the state. We were wondering, we were hoping, we could buy a breeding trio from you, a tom and 2 hens. We don't have much money, but we can pay in installments, and we'll do whatever you tell us. We want to learn. Alara looked at their earnest, hopeful faces. She saw in them not just a desire to make a living, but a genuine hunger to learn a better way. They were the successors she hadn't known she was waiting for. I won't sell you the birds, she said. Their faces fell. They had expected this, a refusal. I'll give them to you, she continued, her voice even. On one condition. You don't just take the birds. You take the knowledge that comes with them. You will come here one day a week for a year. I will teach you the pastures. I will teach you how to read the flock. I will show you what my father showed me. The birds are no good without the wisdom. Do you agree? Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. David nodded, unable to speak. They had come asking for a transaction and had been offered a legacy. They had come to buy a product and had been given a purpose. The script of Oakhaven Valley was being rewritten. The final thematic statement was not written in a report or spoken in a meeting. It was lived day by day on the land itself. It was in the sight of young David Miller learning to move electric fencing on his small, newly leased pasture. It was in the sound of heritage turkeys, the descendants of Alara's flock, gobbling on a neighboring farm for the first time in a generation. It was in the quiet satisfaction Alara felt as she watched the young couple grow in skill and confidence. Some things don't become obsolete. They simply wait. They wait for the noise of progress to quiet down. They wait for the new, brittle systems to fail. They wait for people to remember the slow, patient, resilient wisdom that is written not in code, but in the soil, in the blood, and in the accumulated experience of generations. The strength, after all, was never in the fence. It was in the bird.